Hi, folks. This is Empowering Democracy, and tonight's topic is changes following a likely Russian victory in Ukraine, Part 9. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. I expect to be joined in a few minutes by Dee Peers and by Madeline Hoffman. Dee Peers, of course, is the co-host of her own show, okay, which is called Around the World with Dee and Friends. And I was on that show just a few minutes ago. And Madeline Hoffman is a noted peace activist, okay, who is dedicated to working towards international peace and was the head of an institute for that purpose for, I believe it was 15 years during the 2000s. She now resides in Colombia. She recently moved there and is working for peace there, okay, as well. And I expect her to join us for a limited time tonight. We're usually joined by Waldie also. He's a very good friend and very knowledgeable about the international situation that we currently see before us, okay, the Ukraine war and the likely changes that are going to result from it. He will try to join, but he's encountered a security problem in the computer systems at work, and so he has an emergency situation there, and that, of course, has priority over his appearance here. So he's told me he will work hard to resolve the situation and to come on at some point this evening, but in view of the seriousness of that situation, not to really expect him. So that's the situation that I have now. So, okay, I'm going to go on and discuss some of the things that have been going on, okay, in Ukraine war, what the current situation appears to be right now. I'll also talk about the intervention of the Chinese and the developing political situation here in the United States, which of course is relevant, okay, to the discussion of a likely Russian victory, okay, in Ukraine. So here we go. And here's Dee, by the way. So here is Dee Peers, as I said a moment ago, the host of Around the World with Dee and Friends. And Madeline Hoffman may be joining us.
Yeah, she's just getting something to eat. She said she's going to be right on.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dee.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. So I've started to talk about the developing situation as we move towards the likely Russian victory, okay, in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, first of all, there's of course continuing talk of the counteroffensive by the Ukrainians, which keeps getting postponed, more and more postponed, while the Russians fight a war of attrition that has resulted in huge casualties for the Ukrainians. more and more news sources here in the United States and internationally are beginning to grant the idea that there might have been as many as 300,000 fatalities, okay, among the Ukraine forces since the start of the war. Okay, and also they're beginning to recognize the continued attrition when it comes to Ukraine forces. The Bakhmut situation has been a tragedy now for a long time, and very large numbers of casualties have been suffered by the Ukrainians. Now, the Ukrainians claim that Russia suffered something like 100,000 casualties in trying to take the Bakhmut area, and that its conquest is not yet complete. But from the sources that I see, roughly 95% of Bakhmut is now controlled by the Russians, and there's a remaining very small section where the Ukrainians are still entrenched. There are also claims that the Russians have suffered 100,000 casualties in the effort to complete the conquest, okay, of Bakhmut and the surrounding areas. Observers on the spot and commentators who have been studying the situation from day to day very closely believe that claim of the Ukrainians is ridiculous, and that the casualty load for the Russians is much, much lower, 20,000 casualties, okay, or less. And the Ukrainian casualties are reported to be, well, perhaps it's they who've lost 100,000 in terms of the defense, okay, of Bakhmut. There are still plans afoot for the counteroffensive, okay, but the Ukrainians are saying they haven't gotten the necessary material from the collective West to really be successful in prosecuting a counteroffensive. There are suspicions based on data that has been gathered and the positioning of the Ukrainian forces that they will try to attack from the Kherson region and cut off the land bridge between the Russian territories in the east, okay, and Crimea. And that then they will attempt the conquest, okay, of Crimea, okay, itself. Most of the military authorities who have been watching the situation, and here, okay, is Madeline Hoffman, the peace activist now. Thank you, Madeline, for coming aboard.
My pleasure.
I have taken the liberty of introducing you somewhat earlier,
Okay.
show an expectation that you would be here.
Okay.
Okay, and now discussing some of the developments in the war that are current, and was just focusing on the possible offensive by the Ukrainians to cut off the land bridge from the Donbass area to Crimea,
Jeez.
and then to attempt the conquest, okay, of Crimea. And I was just saying, most of the military authorities who have been talking about this, including some military authorities from the United States, are saying that this is very, very likely to fail because the Russians have spent a lot of time building very strong defenses in various areas that they have already conquered. So the outlook, supposedly for the Ukrainians, is very, very desperate. But people seem to believe, these military authorities seem to believe that they will attempt this final throw to try to create a favorable basis for negotiation that has yet to come. Now, over the last week or so, a week and a half or so, I haven't been paying close attention of late to the exact timeline. There was a phone call between Zelensky, the president of the Ukraine, and Xi Jinping. Of course, the head of China. I always have trouble finding out the correct way to pronounce it, whether it's Xi Jinping or Xi Jinping. I'm not sure. I've seen people who are who are well ensconced in China calling him Xi Jinping, and that's the pronunciation that I favor based on previous experience I've had with Chinese people. Okay, but anyway, the Chinese released a readout of that phone call over the
Mm.
last 2 days, okay, or so. And they are offering themselves to the Ukrainians as basically honest brokers,
Mm.
okay, and are saying that there's much for Ukraine and for Zelensky to gain by accepting their mediation of the conflict. Specifically, Ukraine has been a part of the Belt and Road Initiative, with the Chinese are pushing all over the world virtually, and that uh, they are prepared to help to rebuild uh, the areas occupied by the Ukrainian government once the war is over and a settlement is reached, and that they will continue to include the Ukraine area in the Belt and Road Initiative. Uh, Talking to the Ukrainians, but she was about the economic gains that could flow from this and the importance of the initiative and the key role the Ukrainians could play in it, because geographically they're in a position to profit very greatly from the Belt and Road Initiative. And so she was offering to them his good offices to try to negotiate a peace with Russia. And of course, as you all know, he's very influential with Russia, Putin. Uh, and she, in that telephone conversation, was very careful to outline uh, um, um, the benefits that would accrue to Ukraine, okay, if Zelensky accepted this offer,
Mhm.
allowed China to mediate, and also the costs if they refuse to allow China to mediate. Because there are potential costs, uh, insofar as the Chinese might not continue with their pushing of the Belt and Road Initiative through Ukraine. So that is the negative part. The costs, okay, if Ukraine doesn't accept this proposal to mediate. Xi Jinping was very careful, however, to talk about essentially maintaining sovereignty, okay, of Ukraine and respecting the principles, okay, of international law in dealing both with Ukraine, okay, and Russia. Uh, and so, at least based on the Chinese readout, okay, the telephone call, he seemed to be very careful to presenting himself as someone who intends to be, okay, an honest broker, and while acknowledging the facts on the ground, but someone who would help the negotiation to be one that would be of benefit to the Russians and also of benefit to Zelensky, okay, and to Ukraine. So it isn't clear yet what effect the phone call has had on the situation. But it is clear that the U.S. is furious over the phone call
Yes, because they never got a phone call.
because they never got a phone call. And basically, Xi Jinping has been refusing to talk to people from the U.S. who want to talk to him.
Joe, was there anything in the conversation mentioned about the US?
Uh, okay, I didn't, in the accounts of the readout that I've watched so far, I haven't heard anything about that, but there was something that is very important for U.S. foreign policy in there anyway, even though I don't know whether the U.S. was mentioned by name at all. And that is, uh, it was implicitly demanded of Zelensky that at the start of the phone call, that prior to their getting into serious conversation, he was expected to directly state that he recognizes that China, okay, is one, and that Taiwan is part, okay, of China. And according to the readout, he did recognize that, and that was something of a foundation for the rest of the phone call.
Which would not have made the US very happy.
Would not have made the United States very happy, even though the one China policy is still very visible on the State Department website of the United States. The United States has never said that it's no longer pursuing the one China policy, though all its actions indicate that it's not pursuing the one China policy. Okay, but the U.S., of course, okay, was furious, and there apparently are some other consequences as well. There is news rather sub rosa now, but this comes from contacts uh, and from rumors that were picked up actually by the old CIA hand, specifically Ray McGovern,
Oh, yes.
who has been watching the situation in Ukraine very, very carefully
And Russia and China over many years.
over many years, and still has a lot of contacts inside of the government and the intelligence the community.
Mm.
And Ray was saying today okay, on a podcast called Judging by Freedom, that there is news circulating behind the scene that the head of the State Department, specifically Tony Blinken, is about to be thrown under the bus by the Biden administration. If this news is well founded, then one of the architects of the aggressive U.S. foreign policy towards both Russia and China will be gone. Okay, now whether his dismissal will also involve the departure of Jake Sullivan and the Undersecretary of State,
It's not John Bolton, is it?
oh no, John Bolton is not a part of the Biden administration.
Yes, but he's appearing in a lot of videos as being someone who, from the old guard, who's always looking for a fight. And so.
John Bolton, okay, is a neocon.
Mhm.
And I believe in the Biden administration, he's basically persona non grata. I don't think he would get any kind of appointment.
I'd have to take a look at the videos more closely,
Okay.
yeah, to see what role he's playing. But the title on that was, will this man ever go away, kind of thing. Because he's been behind a lot of U.S. aggression in Latin America and all over the world.
The undersecretary who might also be leaving is Victoria Nuland.
Okay, yeah, she's no picnic either.
Right. She, of course, was instrumental in the coup of 2014. That was the initiating factor of the crisis, okay, in the Ukraine. Okay, because the government that she supported in the takeover there was the government that started the anti-Russian policies, which actually resulted in 14,000 fatalities for the people of the Donbass, who are primarily Russian, during the period from 2014 to the start of the war in 2022. There have been additional casualties, of course, since then. But that disastrous policy, the opportunity for it was certainly created by Victoria Nuland and her interference in the affairs of Ukraine in 2013 and 2014. So I think there may be a good prospect for her to go also. She and Jake Sullivan, okay, and Tony Blinken. Now, if that happens, I don't know who Biden is going to replace them with, but their going would represent a material change in the personnel running foreign policy here in the U.S. And as you know, personnel is policy. So there is certainly an opportunity for Biden to change policy here, okay, and to withdraw and to acknowledge the truth, which is that the foreign policy aimed at the disintegration of Russia has failed, and that there may be a new foreign policy in the offing. I certainly hope that there is.
Yeah, but unfortunately, behind one neocon is another. And so, what are your thoughts about how likely that prospect is, Joe? That any U.S. president would admit to making the kinds of mistakes that he actually has made. That would be a very rare occurrence.
Yes, ma'am, would be a rare occurrence. And of course, I don't expect him to admit error because I've never heard Biden actually admit error. The attitude they have had over the years is no matter how big the error, you never admit it.
Mhm.
Okay, but I'm not looking for him to admit error. What I'm looking for him to do is to change policy without admitting any error.
Hmm.
And I think there are huge grounds for him to change policy because of all the money that's been committed to this. But it's not simply a question of the money. Okay, it's also a question of the resources. The drain on U.S. military resources and the drain on the economic resources of Europe, okay, of NATO nations, uh, has been really catastrophic. The military capability of the NATO allies, including ourselves, has been drained. Now, we may have a long term capability if we want to persist in this foolishness to build up again. The
Hmm.
United States has a tremendous capacity to build up again, but it seems foolhardy here. It just seems like it would so disturb the political system of the United States and so increase the chances of the Democrats losing power that, from a political point of view, it makes no sense to persist in this. It is a much better idea to, say enough is enough, to back off, uh, to appoint some people who are
Mhm.
willing to negotiate and to change course. And I think that also applies to the very hostile moves that have been taken towards the Chinese, okay, in Asia. Uh, that is not something favored by the Europeans, okay, in general. It's not favored by the Korean populace, okay, or the Japanese population. We really don't have a lot of support, actually, for it. And the military situation is such that it's not even favorable to us on the naval side. The Russians currently have submarines that can fire hypersonic missiles, but from the submarines with nuclear warheads. Uh, we don't have the capability to defend against this. I think generally, okay, our submarine forces, okay, are still superior to the Russians, but at the same time, we don't have that particular capability. So there's no realistic prospect of avoiding huge damage in any nuclear war with the Chinese Russian alliance. So it seems to me without the neocons in key foreign policy positions, uh, it doesn't seem to me that a new group is likely to vigorously pursue the policy it's lately been pursuing.
Joe, quick question, very quick question.
Sure.
We don't, none of us expects a US president to apologize for anything that the US has ever done, because we haven't, ever, as a country. But if there's a change in policy direction, wouldn't the world see that as an admission of an error? If
Well,
suddenly the policy changes?
uh, the world currently sees that Ukraine policy is not working. And if there is no coming offensive, okay, or if the coming offensive quickly fails,
Yes.
as is very, very likely, and then gives way to a Russian counteroffensive
Mhm.
that greatly outnumbers the Ukrainians and is very, very powerful in terms of equipment and ammunition and everything that is necessary for the Russians to have. Uh, we are looking at the collapse of the Ukraine in that particular scenario, the economic collapse and the military collapse, and the possible conquest of the whole, okay, of Ukraine. But people in the international sphere are now recognizing that the Ukraine policy has failed. So whether we admit that it's failed or we don't admit, okay, it's failed, its failure is much more obvious to foreign nations than it seems to be to our policymakers. And
Now,
this
didn't,
proved to them that there is no failure. Okay, so US policymakers either have the choice, okay, of not acknowledging failure, trying to put lipstick on a pig, okay, they have that choice, okay, or they have the choice of uh, a real catastrophe, a total catastrophe, okay, in Ukraine that makes it very obvious to everyone that uh, we did not have the military power to prevail, that we are a falling empire, and that there is little that we are willing to do about it unless we intend to convert to a total war footing. And the justification for that doesn't seem to be there because China is following a peaceful foreign policy, including everyone it can get inside of the Belt and Road Initiative. They're offering great economic advantages to people who take part, nations that take part, okay, in the initiative. Uh, there are financial uh, financial kinds of advantages that are very substantial because the Chinese are willing to make loans. Hi, Sandy. Great to see you. At very low interest. Okay. And also, uh, these are not necessarily loans in dollars. In other words, they're acting completely differently from the World Bank, okay, and the IMF and U.S. financial uh, um, um, types of policies. They're really acting in a very collaborative way with a host of nations in Africa, in Asia, okay, and in Latin America.
I was just going to mention Latin America.
Yeah. So
And
if we want to compete with them as a nation, uh, we have to start using a collaborative foreign policy also. We really have no choice. We can't try to compete with them using the same sorts of instrumentalities that we have offered to developing nations in the past, because no one will want to deal with us on that basis when the Chinese are right there.
yeah, the world sees through the US at this point. I would agree with that. What do you mean, though, about a total war footing? It seems to me if we're not a total war footing, we're at something like 90% or
No,
92%.
we're not anywhere near 90%. Think back to World War II.
But how do you define it? That's what I'm
World
asking.
War II was total war footing. Okay, it was obvious. Most production in the United States at that time was devoted to the war. There was rationing, okay, of products, economic products. We had a population of less than 150 million people when we entered the war, and we drafted 15 million people into the armed services, okay, at that time. So that was greater than 1/10 of the population, okay, actually in the armed services. Okay, right now, by comparison, we have a country that is more than twice as large in population as it was then, probably 2.5 times as large, and we only have 1 million people in the armed forces.
Because there's no draft.
Because there's no draft, but the point is, we're not on a total war footing. If we were on a total war footing, we'd have something like 40 million people in the armed services. And we'd be trying to project our power all over the world and to conquer all kinds of places. However, what allowed this total war footing in World War II was the palpable threats from the Japanese, who attacked us in 1941, and of course the threat of the Nazis. Those were the things that allowed popular opinion to get behind a total war here in the United States. But we don't have that situation with the Russians, okay, and the Chinese.
But that's exactly what the Project for a New American Century wants. The Project for a New American Century, with people like Paul Wolfowitz and Donald Rumsfeld and a whole bunch of the people that were involved in, the lead up to the war in Iraq in 2003. And they have written in their document, Rebuilding America's Defenses, that what they wanted then was to be able to challenge any attack on U.S. hegemony, and they wanted to have the military follow their corporations. And they said, and I saw it with my own eyes, I didn't just believe somebody who said it. They said, just as you referred to, in order for that to happen, we would need another Pearl Harbor. We would need either extensive education of the U.S. public and our allies, or another Pearl Harbor.
Well,
And so 9/11, Pearl Harbor?
We don't have another Pearl Harbor right now, and I don't think we're going to get one from the Russians. I don't think we're going to get one from the Chinese.
No, I don't either.
Okay, another Gulf of Tonkin incident is not going to do it. It's got to be another Pearl Harbor. And as I said, we're not getting another Pearl Harbor from the Chinese, and we're not getting one from the Russians.
But some thought that 9/11 was a Pearl Harbor.
Well,
I'm not saying I agree or disagree. I'm just
okay. I'm saying it wasn't another Pearl Harbor because it wasn't a military attack from a great power on the United States. In 1941, the Japanese were a great power. Okay, this was an attack on the United States by basically international insurgents. We spoke of them, okay, as terrorists. If you want to use that word, that's fine. But the point is, they weren't a serious military threat to the United States. They killed 3,000 people, yes, but they were no threat to the physical safety of the whole country. it wasn't the same as Pearl Harbor.
That didn't, okay,
And
I'll let you keep,
we're not
I'll
going to
keep
get
going.
that kind of attack from Russia as a first move, and we're not going to get that kind of attack from China. All we're going to get from China is offers of continuing commercial relations, continuing collaboration of of various kinds. And from Russia, they're looking to Asia and to develop in Asia and the Russian Federation, okay, at home. With Ukraine, we built up a threat to them. We built up a military threat, okay, over 9 years. We deliberately did it. We deliberately provoked them. Once that threat is gone, the Russians are going to turn to Asia. The only thing that would make them turn to Europe is if NATO decided to change completely the relationship to the US. Okay, and if NATO dissolved, in fact, and the individual nations of Europe were to turn to Russia again to have commercial relations, so they were able to get energy from Russia, which they sorely need, and which we have not been able to replace. Okay, so I believe that if Zelensky and the Ukrainians, if they accept the offer of the Chinese to broker a negotiation, they can have a negotiated settlement. Of course, they will no longer have to affiliate with the collective West, and they will no longer have to so blatantly ally themselves with the United States. They're going to have to look to the East if they want to have peace. That will be a condition of a negotiation. I think there's no doubt about that. But there's much advantage for Ukraine to take on that if it's possible for Zelensky to counter the internal opposition he's going to get from the Nazis. But I think a lot of the Nazis have been killed in this war. And a lot of them have gone to the western part of the Ukraine, which may not remain a part of the Ukraine. I don't know how this war is exactly going to be settled. Okay, but I doubt the continuing power of the Ukrainian Nazis to stop a move by Zelensky to settle with the Russians through mediation by the Chinese. We'll have to see. But I doubt they're any longer in a position to assassinate Zelensky. But we have to see. That, might prove a problem.
Right, for Zelensky, it doesn't look good. It doesn't look good for Zelensky to stick around with the USA. I mean, the world is going with the East. And, if you're Zelensky, to me, I was looking at the situation. If you're looking at the pros and the cons, you know what the West leaves behind.
Mhm.
I mean, if you're smart, you're going to listen to China. But like I said, we have to see what he does.
Well, it's likely that Russia will offer something too, in the way of positive incentives for the Ukrainians. Okay? Of course, the Ukrainians will never be allowed to govern the Donbass again.
No. Remember when when he listened to the Donbass region basically saying, save us here, we're going under. we want to become independent states, and Putin immediately responded, and that was another thing that precipitated U.S. anger and retaliation.
Yes. So anyway, that's the situation as I see it. I think that there's very little that we can do to stop it. I don't think there's going to be a lot of support at home for a direct war with the Russians. I
No.
think everybody perceives the military as too serious. Uh, if Biden dismisses the neocon from power and replaces them with people who are looking for peace, I doubt this would ever happen.
I would love for it to happen, but
But
It's a
if
big
I
if.
were in Biden's position, the person I would turn to become the Secretary of State is Jeffrey Sachs.
mm-hmm.
The appointment of someone like that, Jeffrey Sachs, or John Mearsheimer, or
Mm-hmm.
somebody like that, the appointment of that kind of person would signal to the Russians and Chinese that we have chosen the course, okay, of peace, and that we will no longer follow a neocon foreign policy. Okay, so uh, okay, we have to watch the personnel situation very clearly and look at it from the standpoint of what that will signal to the Chinese. If it's really true that we're looking at the dismissal of the neocons uh, from any power over foreign policy, then that will also have to involve some signal to the Chinese through new personnel that there is a change in foreign policy going on here in the United States. So the next few weeks, I think, are going to be very critical for us all and very critical for the world.
I agree.
If we
I
no
agree too.
if we no longer follow a neocon foreign policy and we withdraw from that, it's also crucial to consider what is going to follow on that. In other words, just because we withdraw from neocon foreign policy in Europe, okay, and Asia, doesn't mean that we are withdrawing from a neocon foreign policy in Latin America. Okay, I
That's
think it
true.
probably does mean that we won't have a neocon foreign policy in Africa because the African nations of late have been very bold and very definite in saying they have no interest in dealing with the United States and its neocon foreign policy any longer. And they don't consider us right now a reasonable competitor to the Chinese in terms of some nation that they want to collaborate with for further development. So we have a choice to make there. Either we totally change our foreign policy there and make it a collaborative foreign policy, or we simply decide to ignore Africa and we follow a neocon policy, okay, in Latin America. Okay, but I don't think we have the power to continue the neocon foreign policy, okay, in Africa.
Yes, I agree with you, and I really think that Biden, you're kind of hearing him kind of backing away some. So I think, like you said, they're transitioning. I think a foreign policy staff, and I do know where Israel is concerned that McCarthy was over there, and he's buddies up with Netanyahu, saying that, I demand that Netanyahu visit, the U.S. and that he get his invitation. If Biden doesn't give the invitation, I'm going to give the invitation. We want Netanyahu over here speaking in front of our Congress. But you notice that
Mm.
Biden has not given an invitation, and they're backing off of Israel with their crap. So I think we're going to see a transition, some kind of team, what
Yeah,
it's going to
I
be.
think we're going to see some kind of transition also because some kind of transition with respect to Russia, because right now Netanyahu and Putin are evidently quite close. Okay, but I think there's an inherent conflict there because with China brokering a peace between the Arab nations and Iran, you now have a situation where there's a conflict between Chinese foreign policy and the friendliness of Russia to Netanyahu. To me, that doesn't look like a stable relationship. Okay, in the longer run. Okay, I think the Russians are likely to accept the Chinese initiative, and that leaves the Arabs, okay, and the Islamic peoples, okay, as basically partners of the Chinese, okay, in the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yes, because Palestine signed on to the Palestinian Authority, signed on to the
Yes,
Belt and Road.
yes. So I see changes coming there. I think they're hopeful changes for the world, okay, at large. I don't think they're helpful for Israel unless they get rid of this regime really, really quickly and start putting the settlers back where they belong, and that is not in control of Israel foreign policy. Okay, so we have to watch that part of the situation very carefully, whether the ties of Netanyahu and Russia, okay, are loosened. I think they're going to be loosened.
I
And
think so too.
eh,
I hope so.
yes,
Well, Russia, like we said, when it came to Syria, Russia was invited into Syria. And obviously, Netanyahu and Russia are in different stances when it comes to Syria.
yes, they were.
Absolutely. And they still are. I don't
Yes.
think Russia would, I didn't hear Russia say anything about the recent Israeli attacks on the Aleppo airport, but you would think that Russia would not be happy with those.
Right, because a lot of the supplies coming in from Iran through Russia, supplies that are going to go to Russia, stuff that goes through the Syria airports. Um, so there is that relationship with Iran, Syria, and Russia.
And I think, Robert brings up the whole issue of NATO and what one NATO country might do to another and the role of NATO and all this. And I think that we have to keep a really close eye on that too.
Yes.
And, and for my money, NATO's outlived its usefulness a long time ago, but it's still, it was not
Yeah.
supposed to be in Latin America. It was not, it's doing things that its mission was never to be.
It wasn't
So,
supposed to be in Africa.
no.
It wasn't supposed to be in Asia.
Mm-mm.
It's completely transformed from the terms of the treaty.
Mm-mm.
I
So
think NATO is now
it's
past tense.
just outrageous what's
Yes, yes, it is. It's supposed to be a defense, it's supposed to be a defensive organization, and
well,
it's turned into an aggressive,
yes, it was.
offensive nation.
Okay, if there's a country that might do something stupid, uh, I guess I have to point to Poland. okay, in that sense, because Poland is another nation of over 40 million people with a substantial military, and I don't know. I don't trust the Poles, but I also think that or they know the Russians are far stronger than they, and the military capability of Russia as a result of the Ukraine war has now expanded by 3 times.
Mm.
In other words, you were looking at 500,000 to 600,000 troops at the start of the war. Now you're looking at 1.5 million people in the armed forces.
Mm.
So they just ginned it up very, very quickly, and they devoted a considerable part of their economic effort, okay, to military production. And they have just been producing tanks,
Mm.
planes, and artillery shells at mind boggling rates.
Mm.
And the Chinese are not even involved in that.
And is the ruble still, one of the strongest? Has it continued to remain strong and get stronger?
Yes, it's continued to remain strong and get stronger because the economy in Russia has compensated because Putin turned to Asia and made deals with the Indians
Mm.
uh, to take oil and gas, okay, from Russia. And of course, the Chinese also picked up, okay, a lot of oil and gas, okay, from Russia. And a
Mm.
lot of Central Asian nations have done the same thing. And they basically replaced the European customers with Asian customers. And the irony of it all is that a lot of the Indian oil that was gotten from Russia is now being sold to the Ukrainians at a considerable profit, thus degrading the economies of Europe. But what can they do? They need the oil and gas. So instead of getting it at very favorable prices from Russia, they're now getting it from India, which is taking huge profits on that particular trade.
Could you say in some way that this whole war effort, the 14 years, not the 14, from 2014 to 2022, those years, plus what's been going on the last year or so, could you say that all backfired?
I'm sorry, could I say what?
That it backfired?
Oh, yeah. It's that the sanctions policy has completely backfired because the Russian economy has gotten stronger. Of course, this hasn't affected the Chinese economy at all, which continues to be very, very strong. And the sanctions have backfired on Europe really terribly. I mean, Germany is a mess.
Yeah.
France is far weaker. There's an economic mess, okay, in Italy because they've taken part, okay, in the sanctions also. And the same is true of, a number of the other countries in Europe. It's been an economic disaster for them. Lots of German factories have closed. The only reason why they survived, okay, the last winter is because it was a particularly mild winter. The coming winter is expected to be much worse, and they're going to need that fuel. And one thing that is promising for them is if there's peace, okay, in Ukraine, okay, and the war ends, maybe the Nord Stream pipeline is not going to be repaired, But there's a new pipeline going through Turkey, which I understand is prepared to be adequate to fulfill the gas needs, okay, of Europe, both the oil and gas needs, okay, of Europe. And of course, Turkey has increasingly become a part of uh, the Belt and Road Initiative,
Hmm.
collaboration with the Russians. This has been one foreign policy disaster for the United
Hmm.
States. Of course, in the long run, it might be good for the United States.
Because then we would recalibrate everything and strike out in a new direction.
We would recalibrate everything and turn inward
Hmm.
for a while and meet and solve our problems here while reconstructing our own manufacturing capacity. And it's very clear that what our elites tried to do was to offshore the manufacturing capacity around the world so they wouldn't have to deal with labor here to increase their profits. And the result of that has been a considerable amount of deindustrialization of the United States.
Yes.
This, of course, has been bad for labor. It's been good for the elites. It hasn't been good for the rural areas in the United States. It hasn't been good for the states in the central part of the country, where industry was basically closed down. It hasn't been good for New England industry. Generally speaking, it hasn't been good for the American people. The financialization, okay, of the economy is a disaster waiting to happen. Uh, and the only way for us to respond successfully to all this is to rebuild our manufacturing capacity and begin to compete on a worldwide basis with that particular manufacturing capacity. Much fewer profits have to flow to the elites, and a much bigger share of the pie has to go to the working population. And we have to reorient that. And we need a president who's going to think in those terms. And right now, well, of course, we don't have too many people declaring for the presidency. The one who's declared, who's most likely to respond with that kind of model, is probably RFK Jr. That seems fairly obvious to me. Uh, anyway, those changes remain to be seen. I have no idea whether they're going to occur. It depends a lot on whether big movements should start in the United States over the next year. Uh, I don't know what's going to happen there. But I do know that big changes are afoot and that new possibilities, okay, are opening up, and that we have to take advantage of those kinds of policies. So Madeline just said she's going to slip out quietly. She can't keep her eyes open anymore. And she says, good show. Okay, so I agree with that it is a good show. I'd like to turn to the comments now. Okay, unless you have a final statement to make, Dee.
No, I just have to say I agree with what you said. We're going in a new direction, and we really need labor and everybody else to really get out in the streets and really get out there, and people have to speak out more. This is the time to do it.
It's just the time to people have to speak out more and they have to organize politically. And frankly, they have to organize behind people who are likely to bring change and organize away from Joe Biden. It has to
Exactly.
be made clear to him that unless he changes, and he changes radically in a very short time, he has no hope before the presidency, that his hope is gone. This is going to be increasingly apparent, okay, in the primaries. He's fixing right now to give up on the New Hampshire primary and to say it doesn't matter if he gets slaughtered there because South Carolina is more important anyway because of the diversity of South Carolina. But I don't know. That it could be RFK will make a strong showing in South Carolina. Uh,
Yeah.
Historically, his family has strong ties to the civil rights movement. Of course, we all know that. Uh, I can't think that black people in the United States would prefer Joe Biden to RFK, no matter what Jim Clyburn says.
And RFK Jr. He has a history. He's been on social media. People have seen him. Where the environment is concerned.
Yeah.
So he is a person that is out there that cares about things. Who cares about issues? He cares about the environment. He cares about people. Um, you could just go back on YouTube on his many speeches on many different issues.
Yes, I entirely agree. He is strong where Biden is weak.
Well, Biden's, the Delaware banking industry. That was always his thing, being hooked up with the banks.
Yeah, he hooked up with the banks. He's hooked up with the healthcare industry. They've spent a tremendous amount of money on him in order to keep the possibility of Medicare for all, okay, away. He definitely represents them when it comes to Medicare for all.
Right, he
They
represents the
know it,
path.
and they're going to continue pumping large quantities of money into his campaign.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, it's going to be natural for RFK, even though he hasn't done so far. It's going to be natural for him to be very explicit about support for Medicare for all. And that's going to create another cleavage that will work to RFK's advantage because so much of the population is in favor of Medicare for all, and the elites have stubbornly resisted passing it. Okay, the health insurance companies are hated. The pharmaceutical companies, okay, are hated. Okay, I don't know that the providers are hated, but the hospitals sure are.
Right,
So
and people they've seen what Biden has done nothing for them.
yeah, yeah, they're seeing it, and I think they're inclined to go a different way. Of course, the Biden administration and the DNC will do everything they can to rig the primaries. We are certainly seeing that. Of course, they tried to do that in the first place by making South Carolina the first primary, but they'll continue to try to rig. And I don't know how Bobby Kennedy, is going to fight that, but he's a lawyer and he's won a lot of lawsuits, and he may put together a legal team to continuously challenge the attempts to rig, throughout the whole primary. If he's wise, he's certainly going to do that. If he's wise, he ought to be developing a basis for breaking any contract he signs with the DNC if and when they try to rig the primary.
Yeah, that's null and void for a rigged primary. If it's
Yes,
rigged, it's null and void.
I think he can make that case, but he's got to prepare a strong legal team to do it. But he's in a position to do it. I mean, he has the legal contacts. He's cultivated them over the years.
Yes, he has.
That's very different from Bernie Sanders and his challenge. And Robert Copeland says, if Russia was as powerful as they claim to be, they would have won the war spring of last year. No, Robert. No. They didn't have enough troops. They've been expanding to 1.5 million troops. Well on their way to reaching that goal now. They're probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 million troops now. But when they went into Ukraine, they went in with only 200,000 troops. That's why they didn't win in the spring. Putin miscalculated. He believed that it was possible to get Zelensky to settle. We have to point out that he was almost right. There were negotiations being brokered by the Turks. In April of 2022, those negotiations were broken up by Boris Johnson, who flew to Ukraine and said to Zelensky, all Western support would be withdrawn from Zelensky if he made peace with the Russians. So peace was torpedoed right then by the collective West. That is what happened. It is a fact. Steve Wolfbrandt asks Robert Kennedy Jr. Yep, Robert Kennedy Jr. I need to know about the Belt and Road Initiative. At first, I thought it was Belton, named after someone. In brief, I can't express this in detail, but China has for years envisioned and begun to support with economic agreements in nations all over the world a concept called the Belt and Road Initiative. What that's about is building transformation infrastructure through the Eurasian landmass and also down to Africa and even beginning to penetrate in Latin America to move trade all over the world, largely by land. The initiative is very popular in Central Asia. The Russians, of course, are part of it. Actually, Ukraine was part of it itself and was dealing with China to implement the Belt and Road Initiative. To express the idea simply, and I do have to drink some tea because I'm getting real dry here. The metaphor in concept was to restore in modern terms the old Silk Road of trade from China, but going all the way into Europe. This is China's attempt to embrace relations with the whole of Asia and the whole of Europe. Relations, tight trading relationships through the Eurasian landmass. And there are also moves by the Chinese to extend this to Africa of course, which would primarily take place through shipping, but also building infrastructure inside of Africa to develop trade relations throughout the whole of Africa, and then to proceed by ocean trade with the rest of the world. The Chinese have been implementing this plan. It is their foreign policy, the main ingredient of their foreign policy. And it is very exciting because it's collaborative. It brings nations together. It is not conflictful. We need a similar vision here. We need to, of course, incorporate as much of Latin America as we can in that initiative. And we need to devote our technological capability to uplifting the nations in this hemisphere, especially. We need a vision like that, and we don't have one. We haven't cared to build any. Our whole vision has been to dominate the rest of the world instead of to uplift the rest of the world. You know that. Robert says, did you know that there's a city in Ukraine named New York? No, I did not know that, but it doesn't surprise me. Steve Wolfman said, I think it's something about rebuilding the old Silk Road trade route, but I'm not really sure. Yeah, that's the metaphor they use. But of course, it goes beyond the old Silk Road train route. It includes things like building super trains to run from Europe to Asia, high-speed trains traveling 600 miles an hour, okay, or more. It's the old Silk Road on modern steroids.
Weren't we going to do that with a high-speed train from New York to California? What happened to that?
Well, of course, it's very hard to get any infrastructure bills through Congress because the Republicans only support the car and, don't want to do anything else. That's another big reason why we have to remake the whole Congress, which may involve, in the end, the destruction of the Republican Party because they're not going to adapt. It may involve the destruction of the Democratic Party because I don't know if they're going to adapt either. But we need the dump the corruption initiative. Everybody has to get real serious about it. But Xi Jinping, I don't think so. I think it's Xi Jinping. Robert Copeland says that is going to be one long road if they have a long road from China to the Ukraine. There's going to be railroad transportation from China to Ukraine. I don't know how much they're going to focus on automobile transportation from China to Ukraine. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of automobile transportation involved here too, because I think there's a lot of road building going on in Central Asia. But I think the main focus is going to be on high-speed rail. Are they using him as an advisor? You mean John Bolton? I don't know why anybody would talk to John Bolton. I don't know that John Bolton knows anything important. Of course, there's Biden. John Bolton would support a war against China. Yeah, John Bolton never met a war he didn't like. Lana says, Victoria, who loves to create victims, good riddance. Lana says, I've heard RFK Jr. say a few times since his launch speech that a humanitarian effort isn't about exhausting the Russian army. Yes, he said that. He said that the purpose of our foreign policy cannot be to dismember Russia and then turn towards China to create problems for them. That was basically what the neocons were doing. They now do seem to have turned much more of their attention directly to surrounding China in Asia. But that's not going to work against the Belt and Road Initiative. It is just not going to work. And I don't think it's working now. I think the people in Asia, including in the island chains, want strong economic relations with China. They don't want to support any wars with China. I don't see much support for the U.S. getting support, from Asian nations. I mean, I don't even think the Japanese in the end are going to support much of that. They rely heavily on China for their trade. China's a bigger trading partner for them than we are. I wonder how much money it would take to rebuild Ukraine once the war is over, and which countries would pay for it. Well, of course, it's going to cost much less in Russian rubles and Chinese yuan than it would cost, in dollars, because the dollar is so overvalued. But in terms of dollars, I mean, I would estimate it's probably going to cost 500, 600 billion to rebuild the place that we destroyed. Steve said, I thought NATO was originally set up to defend against communism. Apparently, communism had nothing to do with it. No. At the time, communism had a great deal to do with it. And the Cold War, against communism had a great deal to do with it. What the problem was, when the Cold War ended, due to perestroika and due to the peace that was made by Gorbachev, we wanted to go into Russia and to exploit it. And we did when Russia was run by Yeltsin. At that time, people were looking around for a justification for NATO. They found it in dismembering Yugoslavia, in the bombing campaign, and in conflict, in the Balkans. So that was the rationale for NATO then. But when that conflict ended, the U.S. was continually pointing NATO at the Russians because Putin had set about to throw out the foreigners and strengthen Russia, internally, specifically with respect to the Federation, the Russian Federation. There was no Soviet Union anymore, of course. And Putin did that. He was very successful. He was a very good governor from the standpoint of bringing Russia and its economy back. Not too many people know this because the truth hasn't really come to the West much. There's a book called The Body Economic. I forget the author's now. But much of that book was devoted to the Russian tragedy during Yeltsin's time, to the breakdown of communism and those parts of the social welfare state that the communists had set up. Long story short, the population of Russia, when the breakup first took place, was about 150 million people. That was down from the Soviet Union's population, which at its height was something like 270 million. So, what happened to this nation of 150 million? It's estimated in this book of the Body Economic that because of the economic dislocations and disturbances created by the abrupt shift to capitalism inside of Russia and the economic depression that caused in Russia, that 10 to 15 million people died as a result of the economic depression. That millions of Russian males basically committed suicide by alcohol, over that period, because the economy left them nothing to live for. So when you wonder why Putin is so popular in Russia, Putin brought Russia back. He changed all that. He threw a lot of the oligarchs out, those who wouldn't cooperate with him, threw them out or put them in jail. The oligarchs he retained to help him to run took orders from him. And he used them to help to rebuild Russia with their capital that they had amassed during the 1990s. And year by year, the Russians grew stronger. By 2008, they were relatively strong. They kept getting stronger. They regained that 15 million in population they lost by roughly 2020. Now they're a strong nation of 150 million people with a military capacity that is astonishing and a popular regime that is running it. The thought of our neocon foreign policy masters that they would undermine Putin and his regime, that was just dream time on their part. There was never any chance of that. Putin was far and is far too popular. As far as the Ukraine war is concerned, the people in Russia who were other parts of the leadership group wanted Putin to act much more aggressively towards Ukraine than he has acted. He has been the conservative one. He's the one who insisted on the special operation sending in only 200,000 troops. Other parts of his leadership thought he was mistaken about that. It has turned out that he was. And he adapted to that and has now built a much more serious capability. Once he realized that this wasn't a war between Russia and Ukraine, but a war between Russia and NATO, he acted accordingly to win that war. And that is what he is doing. And Sandy Degg says hello. And Sandy Degg says, hi, Joe. And I've already said hi, Sandy. It's so wonderful to see you here. And Steve says, smash the like button. And Sandy says, hi, Lana, Robert, Dee, Bonnie, and Madeline. Thank you, Sandy.
Thank you.
And Sandy leaves a heart. Thank you for that. Sandy says, share. Lana says, how are you, Sandy? Steve says, Sandy, don't be a stranger. Sandy says, I'm good. I just have a lot that's going on. Steve Wolfbrand says, Joe, that scenario would go nuclear in a New York minute. Well, I'm going to say something that you may not agree with. okay, the neo-cons and the neoliberals, okay, inside of the government may want, okay, a nuclear war with Russia and China because they have this idea that we at least have some chance to win, okay, a nuclear war, but that Russia and China will be far too strong in 4 or 5 years for that even to be a possibility. They cannot conceive of the possibility that we could live in peace with the Russians and Chinese and other great powers to be, such as India, okay, and Brazil, and that would be possible. They don't accept the multipolar world. I don't think Joe Biden accepts the multipolar world either. But I don't think that Joe Biden has any appetite for a nuclear war. As old as he is, as confused as he is, he has been part of the attempt to avoid a nuclear war with another superpower since the time he entered the Senate in 1973. Yes, he's been aggressive. Yes, he's been a Cold Warrior. And yes, he's a neoliberal. But there have been some times when he's been cautious. For example, he wasn't for nation building in Iraq. He was like the lone guy in the Biden administration who was opposing that. Sometimes he has been cautious and he has the capacity to be cautious. We haven't seen much of that from him because this has been a time of, hegemony for the United States. But there was a time before that where he was living in the world where there were two superpowers, and they avoided a nuclear war. And he was for that. He never beat the drums for a nuclear war against the Russians. And I don't believe he wants a nuclear war now or the risk of a nuclear war. Even though he's put us in that position by having these neocons run foreign policy. I think he will step back from the brink and he won't continue to risk, a nuclear war. And that if he throws Blinken under the bus now, that will be a sign that he is withdrawing. So we have to see. Steve Wolfbrand says, who would build our cell phones?
We could learn.
Well, we can perfectly well build our cell phones, but I don't see any problem if we basically make peace with China, accept a multipolar world, and accept the Belt and Road Initiative, and adjust to peaceful competition. I don't see any problem with the Chinese continuing to build our cell phones. On the other hand, they might not want to build cell phones for Apple Computer. So maybe we could shift some of the cell phone production here. Steve Wolfbrand says 9/11 was an inside job, Building 7. Well, maybe it was. I don't really know about that. Steve Wolfbrand says controlled demolition. And Steve says, well, China does have the money to rebuild Ukraine. Not only does it have the money, Steve, it has the dollars. I mean, what's the size of its dollar reserves? $1.5 trillion? It could use dollars to rebuild Ukraine if it wanted to. But of course, it has its own currency, and it can print as much money as it needs to print to rebuild Ukraine. Robert says, I think the war in Ukraine might be over sometime this summer unless a NATO country does something stupid like attack Russia or Russia attacks a country that is a NATO partner. I agree with you, Robert. I think it could well end this summer. We have to watch the upcoming offensive very carefully because that could be very destructive to Ukraine forces. For the first time, in the Ukraine war, in recent weeks, the Russians have had pretty much control of the skies, and they're starting to use that control to bomb the hell and missile the hell out of Ukraine. They're going to continue to do that. This has mostly been an artillery war, but if the Ukraine offensive starts, you're going to see a lot of air power unleashed on the Ukrainian army. And remember, let us not forget what air power can do. Do you remember the highway of death that ran from Kuwait to Iraq? That's what it can do. And Ukrainians have increasingly smaller and smaller control over the skies because of what the Russians have done with their bombing and the use of their missiles. I don't think the Ukrainians have the capability to defend themselves against the Russian Air Force, which will soon be released on them. The Russians have been producing planes in very, very large numbers, and their bombers are likely to be very, very effective when there's not much of a fighting force to intercept them, and not much of a missile force to intercept them either. That's where we're getting to, in Ukraine. Number of greetings between Jeffrey and Sandy and Jeffrey. Jeff Denton is here. Robert Copeland says we have a lot of problems here in the United States. We sure do. Sandy says, hi, Robert. And Robert says, hi, Sandy. Robert says, Joe, I don't think President Biden can change for the better. Maybe not. I don't know. When it gets to human psychology, I'm not too sure about anything. Doc, what influence do you see the AI having on that future?
They've learned to read minds.
Well, it's going to have increasing influence, on the future. For good or ill, depends on us. We have to develop controls on the AIs. We have to develop, certainly, privacy controls, surveillance controls, various other forms of controls, on AI. I have some background, in AI. In the early 90s, I did an awful lot of studying of AI and developments in AI. I know things have changed drastically since then, but I still know a lot about the basic principles, of AI and the dangers that can come from those particular principles. I know we have to put in a lot of human controls over the AIs. Lana says, if you haven't yet pushed the like button, please do. Thank you, Lana. Please do push the like button and the share and subscribe buttons too. And Steve says, yep, I do think Joe is toast. I think he's referring to Joe Biden here, not to me. Lana says, RFK Jr. did a great interview with Smirkanish. He did. I saw that interview with Smirkanish. He's been doing great interviews with everybody he's talking to. He did a great interview with Kim Iverson. That was really good. Kim did a wonderful job and maybe put some thoughts in RFK's head. Steve, you mean Biden? Yes, Joe Biden. And Lana says, RFK Jr. said on Smirkanish that there was no legal right to sue for a primary debate, only in the general election. Yeah, he knows that. There's no legal right to sue for a primary debate. Steve says, not the doc. A laugh out loud. Lana says, I have to figure out how to spell Smirkanish. Michael Smirkanish. Well, okay, I think you've got it. I'm not sure. It could be S-M-E-R instead of S-M-I-R. But it may be right the way you spelled it here. And if it's not, you only have to add the E. Steve Wolfbrand says the DNC would be foolish not to debate. That will backfire, okay, in my opinion. It could backfire if Robert Kennedy continues to get popular. Obviously, they're trying to slow him down by not having debates. I think it would have been better for them to have had the kinds of large debates they had in 2020. Maybe put in a few candidates just for the purpose of trying to take Robert Kennedy down, in the debates. Alana says, that road sounds like a good idea. Sandy says, I don't think Biden could handle another 4 years mentally. I don't either. I don't think he could handle another 4 years, but I don't think Robert is going to suggest that. I don't think Marianne's going to suggest that. And I don't think the mainstream press is going to suggest that. Of course, the Republicans are going to have a field day suggesting that in the general election of 2024, because it's so obvious that Biden is, failing mentally now. Much more obvious than it was in 2020. Doc, are the Russian troops trained? Are their hearts in the fight? I wonder. The word is that the Russians got a lot of volunteers. Yes, they did conscript some, but they put out a call for volunteers, and they got a lot of volunteers to fight, in Ukraine. And are the Russian troops trained? Well, first of all, there are a lot of reserves who were called up again, but the new troops who enlisted or who were drafted have been in training, really since the fall. Some of those troops have gotten 6 months of training, already. Are their hearts in the fight? Yeah, I think their hearts are in the fight. Lana says, we definitely need updated infrastructure. Sandy says, everything a mess. Yeah, well, I don't know if they continue to do this, but what was the organization? I used to know this like the back of my hand. But as late as 2017, 2018, there's this very large interest group that's devoted and dedicated to infrastructure. here in the United States. And they were estimating that $4.2 million needed to be spent, okay, on infrastructure back then. Things have gotten worse since then. We're looking at trillions for infrastructure to update it. Why austerity kills. David Strickler. Strickler was one of the co-authors, but I think a guy named Sanjay Bansu was the second co-author. And Lana says, in my audible list, I haven't listened to it yet. Please do listen to it. It is just a terrific book. Bernie sometimes refers to this as deaths of despair. Yes. And that book makes clear that those deaths were deaths of despair in Russia as a result of what happened to Russia when communism fell so suddenly and there was no replacement. Big mistake that Gorbachev made was not to plan for a transition and to implement a transition, because the loss of support by the Soviet state created tremendous problems for the economy of Russia. If you're going to go away from communism, you need a transition period where the leadership is still maintaining the vital functions of the communist state that people need. Sandy says, no one wins a nuclear war. Put it another way, everybody loses a nuclear war. Dr. Joe, have you calculated the U.S. fiscal space recently? Well, to the answer to that question, okay, is no. I need a few minutes to calculate the likely fiscal space where we assume certain desires on the part, okay, of the American people for foreign goods and, okay, also the savings desires, okay, of the American people, because those leakages from the economy of the United States that have to be replaced by deficit spending of the federal government. Okay, I think that, all right, off the top of my head, what do I think? Maybe $2.6 trillion, something like that right now. The fiscal space for deficit spending is huge. And Trump and Biden haven't begun to fill it. Of course, there needs to be, yes, I got your email on the Minnesota healthcare bill, thank you. There needs to be, of course, plans that take into account the fiscal space that's available, but also there needs to be a program to counter the possibility of inflation. The inflation doesn't just come from deficit spending. It comes from the concentration of the economy of the United States, which allows the oligarchs and the hierarchical manufacturing interests, not just manufacturing, but financial interests, to to gouge prices. Price gouging is very, very important, as we learned during the recovery from COVID. We have to put in controls so the price gouging can't exist. Because if we get anywhere near using the full fiscal space, we're going to get that price gouging again. And we might get supply chain disruptions too. So we have to have an economic plan that takes account of that while it's using the full fiscal space. A lot of boomers don't care about the kids. They don't care that Biden is setting up Gen Z for a gloomy future. Yeah, the boomers are very old now. I'm just a few years older than they. And the boomers must be 80 or 81 now, where the boomers start. I think there are a lot of boomers who care about their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. I think you can appeal to boomers on that basis. You can certainly appeal to me on that basis. I'm very worried about my children and grandchildren. And Lana says, maybe post it to Twitter and tag me. Okay. She says, wow, that's a lot. Well, I figure it's 12% of GDP is the fiscal space. Now, if we're doing deficit spending, we'll be using some of that fiscal space. Okay. Now, Trump had some huge deficits, and Biden at the beginning had some huge deficits as well, but they didn't completely fill the fiscal space. Steve Wolfbrand says, I got to bounce. Good night, everyone. Good night, Steve. Thank you very much for your comments and your continuing support. Sandy says, good night, Steve. Lana says, out of touch boomers make me want to pull my hair out. Still watching CNN and ABC or Fox, puke. Well, those are not ordinary boomers. Those are rich boomers who are being fueled by the mass media. When I say fueled, I mean economically fueled by the mass media. They might not care about their grandchildren, but most of the boomers do care about their grandchildren. Lana says, good night, Steve. And I am ended with the comments. So I'm going to say good night as well.
Yes, good night.
Hang on a second. Bonnie's trying to say something to me.
Buy coffee.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Please buy me a coffee.
She took the words out of my mouth. I was just about to say that.
Thank you, Dee. And please occasionally visit my Patreon account. It would be wonderful to get some monthly contributions, however small. However small. I really need that to happen sometime soon because, well, it's just certain effects on the economy
I'm getting old here.
have also been putting a great deal of economic pressure on me. So whatever you could do would be greatly appreciated. Sandy says, Lana says good night all. And Sandy says good night everyone and leaves a bunch of hearts. Thank you, Sandy, for all the hearts. Okay, thank you, everybody. I'll see you tomorrow with a Dump the Corruption show. Thursday, I'll be coming back with a neoliberalism show that we've been doing on Thursday. I've been getting the feeling that we might be sort of getting towards the end of the neoliberalism series, but I'm not sure yet. We still do have a lot to talk about, so we'll see what happens on Thursday. And Friday, there'll be another Dump the Corruption show, of course. And we should be just about getting finished now with the sample of Republicans that we decided to analyze for Dump the Corruption. Okay, establishment Republicans. And that means we're almost ready to begin seeing if there's a different pattern of fundraising among the Freedom Caucus Republicans. I'm going to do 25 of those too. So, Tanana says, I forgot to say I asked Steve Keen to put you on a show. Thank you, Lana. I'd certainly appreciate going on Steve Keen's show. I greatly appreciate his work. I don't know if he's aware of mine, but here we are. Okay. Anyway, thank you very much for tonight. And I think I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you, Dee.
Yes, thank you for having me. And tomorrow I'll be on at 8 p.m. and I'm sure you'll be with me.
I will be with you.
And then I'll be with you at 9.
Okay. Thank you, Dee.
You're welcome. And good night, everybody.
Good night,
Good
everybody.
night.
Good night, Bonnie.
Good night.